Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining us, depending on your time zone. We're really excited to have you today out here to discuss a very exciting topic, microservices. So today we're going to be hitting a few key things out here about how do you really do it right? What are some key recipes of success that we have seen from other customers? So before we get started in here, just a simple disclaimer that we may be talking about some future features as part of the conversation. Please make any purchasing decisions based on currently generally available features. Today, we are hosting this together. So I'm Prithpal Bogil. I'm part of the product management team within Apigee Google Cloud Platform. And we also have Chris.
Hey, Prithpal. Hey, everyone.
Awesome. All right. So we have a pretty interesting agenda out here. So we're going to be hitting on some top questions that we hear when we talk to our customers. You know, what really microservices are, why do them? We'll also be kind of touching on some of the key lessons that we are, finding out. We'll share about some of the recipes for success, and then also kind of give you a taste of what Apigee has to offer in the microservices world. So with that, the question which comes up is, what are microservices? Chris, why don't you give us your taste on what they are?
Yeah, sure thing, Prithpal. So, of course, as the name suggests, microservices are very, very tiny services. They're so tiny. If you are a frequenter of Reddit and you go to one of my favorite subreddits, things for ants, you may say to yourself, well, microservices, what is this? Just SOA for ants? And the answer is no, of course not. There's a lot more to it than that. So what microservices are is that they are an architectural style. So they're essentially a way that we are going to architect our systems and our applications. And one of the easiest ways to describe microservices is by contrasting them with another very common architectural pattern, what we call a monolithic approach. So whereas a monolithic architecture is going to have all the capabilities, all the features of a system put into a single deployable unit that we're going to work on as a whole, microservices says, I would rather take what we might call a bounded context. We might want to break our system up into functional areas so that we can deploy these bits and pieces independently rather than working on things as a whole. Now, I will say, so both Prithpal and I, we're out in the field, we do a lot of traveling, we talk with a lot of different companies, and I'd say it's pretty rare that a week goes by that I don't talk to at least one company who's saying, hey, we're looking seriously at microservices, we're pursuing a microservices strategy. And the motivations for those are, they vary from company to company. So Prithpal, why don't you talk a little bit about, what you're seeing as you're talking with companies in terms of their motivation for adopting microservices?
Absolutely. And I think this is a topic which comes up pretty often. So I think one of the key reasons that they have become popular is the direct business benefits that it provides to enterprises. The first one which comes up is agility. One of the key aspects of microservices is because I can now focus on doing bits and pieces of functionality and release it as a capability which is valuable, it lets me kind of move very fast. So I can roll out chunks of features instead of trying to just push everything into a big monolith and waiting for a big release to happen, right? So that's one key aspect. The other aspect is around productivity. Now just think about what you mentioned previously, Chris. When you look at taking a big monolith application and then breaking it down into different pieces, it also has a big impact on the teams who are working on those pieces, right? So net, what happens is teams become independent. They are much more productive in rolling out those capabilities. And the reuse aspect, I think, when I talk to customers, by far this is the biggest factor that they consider. Because we have this useful chunk of microservices, now I can leverage these capabilities in composing a big application, if you would, or providing a new service very, very rapidly. So the big element of reuse. And, in my conversations, this is actually a big prelude to one of the other things that we see today, which is around cloud adoption, right? As you may have seen, monoliths cannot necessarily leverage the cloud native benefits and features that cloud provides today. Microservices are a lot more kind of tuned towards that orientation, given the way they are developed. So Chris, I know you and me were talking about this the other day. Why don't you share some context around what you have seen customers talk about microservices and more so in the realm of cloud and how the adoption is going?
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot of folks on the webinar who run into this as well. So if most of the time we don't set out to create a monolith. We just set out to create a system, and we just keep adding to it and adding to it and adding to it over time. And when you start to look at which again, the same way that we talk with a lot of companies that are looking at adopting microservices, we talk to just as many, if not more, companies that are moving to cloud. And so one of the challenges they have is, okay, so we've got this monolith, and the first instinct is, if we try to get to the cloud, let's do a lift and shift, and that usually doesn't work out so well. You're going to have problems there with either the application architecture or figuring out how to do a data migration to the cloud or networking concerns. And so microservices can offer a nice stepping stone to get into the cloud. So if you look at some of the features that are available in the cloud, if you look at things like the 12-factor application, microservices align much more closely to the approach that most companies would like to have when they implement a cloud-based architecture. So the nice thing with microservices is they are in lockstep with the other strategic initiatives that companies and enterprises are taking with respect to cloud technologies. Now, that's kind of why I see a lot of companies, moving in this general direction. But a lot of times when we talk with these companies, people want to know, what else do you see out there as you're having these conversations? How are other companies implementing microservices? What frameworks are they using? How does Apigee tie into all this? So, first of all, why don't you talk a little bit about this and what you're seeing when you're talking with customers and other companies in the wild?
Absolutely. So I think one of the key points that you mentioned out here, Chris, was microservices help it make super easy for you on your cloud adoption journey, right? With that, as the internet happened to us, microservices is happening already. Whether you like it or not, I have an opportunity to go meet several customers during the course of my work. And when I talk to them, they are adopting different kinds of microservices stacks. So do not be surprised if within an enterprise you have a variety of different kinds of microservices stacks. You see some popular names up here: Docker, Kubernetes, Cloud Foundry, Mesos, NOS. I mean, just the list goes on and on and on. But there are a few key features that these stacks provide, which is the essential ingredient for your microservices deployment, right? So the first one is the microservices containerization. From that, what they really mean is, because microservices as a design style, as an architecture, enforces the notion of loose coupling and independent teams building something, you need to be able to scale those microservices rapidly. The containerization support kind of makes it super easy. The other aspect is that around reuse. Now, since you have built microservices, you want to be able to effectively look them up so that they could be reused by other teams who are trying to compose new applications. As we start looking at some of the core cloud native constructs, auto-scaling becomes important. One of the key benefits that I'm hearing from developers that they find and get from microservices is the ability for them to just scale, right? So you have a cloud native platform where you can just deploy a microservices, set a few config parameters, or in many cases set auto-scaling, and it will automatically provide whatever infrastructure it needs and the number of instances to be able to serve your live traffic. Things like blue-green deployment, etc., those are becoming some very, very important capabilities for many of our customers to be able to test something very quickly and then turn it off if that doesn't really meet the requirements. So I think there are, the reality is, whether you like it or not, many enterprises have, many of these microservices stacks in their house. So, with that, we've also seen some kind of the right way and the wrong way of doing things. And Chris, the other day, you and me were talking about a few things. Why don't you share your experience on what you are seeing from some of the customers you talked about? What is the right way about developing, in microservices?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think more generally than just looking at the dependencies that we see on this slide, one of the things that I think I see quite a bit is, and we see this not just with microservices, but we've seen this with a lot of different technology advancements, where our expectations get really, really high for microservices. They're going to solve everything from world hunger to world peace, make our system self-healing, and so many different benefits that we're expecting to see. And I think one of the things to understand is that you still need a lot of the other type of technologies that you've got in your ecosystems today. So if you try to take everything that's there and you start to do everything as a microservice, you end up with this huge explosion in the number of microservices that you have to manage. If you start just looking at these as integration points, it could really quickly become unwieldy to manage the different dependencies between microservices, to handle sort of the chattiness that can occur. And in general, I think that's probably one of the most common downfalls that I've seen customers who just embark on microservices. We're going to go microservices in a big way, and we're going to kind of forget all the lessons that we've learned along the way with other technologies. So, and we'll see this a lot of times where customers are struggling to understand the difference between APIs and microservices. And really, from an API perspective, the same way that microservices are a nice stepping stone into the cloud, if you want to go with microservices and you have an existing monolithic application, an API provides a really good facade layer, a nice layer of abstraction on top of your underlying implementation that shield and insulate all of your consumers that need to get access to this data from the underlying implementation details. So whether or not you build out a big Ruby on Rails app, or you've got a big Java enterprise, J2E or Java EE file that you're deploying today, and you want to break that up into Spring Boot or break that up into little Go services, having an API on top of there is going to be to your advantage to give you the flexibility in terms of breaking up that overall architecture. And I think we've had a number of customers at live events, at our conferences, where we've had a chance to talk to them. They've come in, they've talked about some of the really, really cool accomplishments that they've done in the microservices space and how they've been able to get some of those benefits that we laid out at the beginning of this presentation. And I'd say this, this idea of using APIs and microservices as complementary technologies is by far one of the most common themes that we've seen in terms of successful customers with microservices. So, and I know, Prithpal, you've had a chance to talk in your role. You get a chance to talk with a lot of customers and see exactly how they're doing their implementations. What type of patterns are you seeing when you look at APIs and other sort of surrounding technologies that customers are using along with microservices?
Absolutely. So let's kind of talk through that, Chris. So one of the things that you mentioned, I think I just want to re-echo that microservices and API are super complementary, right? And for the reasons that Chris mentioned. But then the question comes up, well, what kind of standards, right? I mean, in my conversations with customers, I obviously see, REST API as being a the most adopted standard, if you would. And there are some very, very pragmatic reasons for it. One of the key things that our customers find that REST APIs are very simple, easy to understand, and essentially they enable easy consumption. Why is that important? It's important because any kind of technology trend that you adopt, including microservices, offers some benefits. But the real benefit is when the rubber meets the road, which means are these services easily consumable by app developers who essentially are trying to use that ecosystem to build meaningful apps. So REST APIs, the style becomes very, very easy for them to be able to consume it. The other aspect is, REST and cloud kind of go hand in hand. When you look at a majority of the APIs offered to you out there by many different providers, they are RESTful in nature. Cloud is a great mechanism for you to be able to expose the REST APIs and let some of the utilities of the cloud, such as independent scaling, etc., kind of give those kind of benefits and pass it on to the consumers. The other aspect is around containerization. And why that's important is, as I mentioned, one of the key features that microservices promises, and in my conversation with many of the developers, they focus on, well, we really want to just kind of deploy our bits, our microservice, rapidly scale it. So containerization becomes very important. They can independently deploy, rev the new revisions, if you would, for different capabilities that they're offering. And so REST API kind of becomes this nice layer on top of it to be able to, offer those microservices out. And this kind of raises a very important question around API exposure, right? So here's a very important part of the entire conversation that we get into. Why even use APIs? I think, Chris touched on some of the conversation that he has had around how it kind of helps you, just have some level of abstraction, so on and so forth. But let's hit on some key points that we find our customers going through. At the end of the day, when you're building, a set of microservices, some of them are gonna become characteristic of used outside your enterprise boundary, or they become important enough and valuable enough that even internally they're tied to some kind of applications that are consuming them. So essentially when that happens, there's kind of a client contract which gets established, if you would, between the consumers of your microservices as APIs and the microservice itself. From that perspective, what you want to do is leverage the API layer to be able to shield the consumers for whatever complexity that you have. Remember the anti-pattern that Chris mentioned a few slides back? So when you have a bunch of microservices, and let's take order as an example. When you expose it as an API, you're signing up as a contract for a consumer to use that capability. So essentially, having this API layer will shield you from your iterations, your revisions, as you bring new and new features to your microservices. At the same time, it makes it super easy for all the consumers to consume those microservices. So I think this is a win-win situation from that perspective. Chris, any quick thoughts on what you are seeing with your customers and your developers out there?
Yeah, so I think this is almost like a lesson learned. It's one of those best practices that's emerged as opposed to a theoretical one. One of the things that when I talk with customers, I talk especially with developers, tech leads, the folks that have their hands in the code who've made a concerted effort to move towards microservices. I think one of the biggest things that they maybe intuitively knew going into it, but we're still surprised by once they got deep into microservices, is that really you're talking about a distributed architecture. So one of the nice things with a monolithic architecture, at least at first, is that deploying, working on this code base is easy. I've got the entire code base and one IntelliJ project, Eclipse project, whatever your IDE of choice is, and sort of one code base that I'm working with. When I do a deployment, I'm deploying one thing. I've got usually one, maybe a couple of database schemas that I'm working with. And that part is usually pretty simple to work with. As they start getting more into microservices, you're going to run into the classic complexity that just comes along with a distributed system in terms of consistency, in terms of reliability, in terms of managing dependencies. And so, from that standpoint, when we look at the types of complexity we're shielding, that's really what we're talking about. The benefits that come from microservices are real. They're very, very substantial. So, some of the things that you hit on before with containerization, avoiding the problems of getting an environment ready to go, being able to scale up a container and scale it down and take advantage of things like Google Container Engine and other things that are out there for those are great. The downside of that is that you do have some of that complexity that comes along, and if you expect consumers of this functionality to embrace that complexity, usually as consumers, that's not what we want, right? Usually if I'm building an application that's going to leverage some piece of your functionality, I just want a nice, easy to consume API. And so that's really what I think this slide, the sort of key takeaway is it's 2 points. One is the more obvious, from a consumption standpoint, we want to have a nice interface. But the other is don't underestimate the complexity that can come along with microservices. And I think, coming up here, we've talked a little bit about how customers are doing that. But those are my thoughts on that, Prithpal.
No, Chris, you bring us some great points. So, in my conversations with a lot of the enterprises, although there are, obvious benefits to developers and teams for doing microservices, at the end of the day, all the benefits of microservices that we spoke about around agility, reuse, et cetera, are all ascertained by enterprises, right? And there are some obvious trends which are emerging in our conversations. Let me just kind of put this thing out there, right? Microservices will fail without API management. Why do we say that? As you have seen in the discussion so far, as your microservices journey begins, you have essentially what we call as a sprawl which happens. There are many different teams who are trying to do a good job of building microservices, but without the right kind of visibility into what's going on, you could very quickly end up into a sprawl, which eventually becomes difficult to manage. The second big aspect that I see, and this is where the leadership of the enterprises are most concerned with, is great, we have a great platform for the developers to kind of be agile, quickly roll out capabilities, but they are very concerned, are the developers taking some key things into account? As an example, if you're rolling out microservices and exposing some of them as APIs, well, do they have the right level of security? We want to ensure that standards like OAuth, etc., are plugged in automatically without having the need to delegate all that responsibility to each and every microservice developer. Things like threat protection, right? So all these are very common cross-cutting concerns, which becomes very important at the enterprise level when they're leveraging a microservices stack to enable that to the enterprise and the outside world. The last one, which I think is probably one of the most important ones, which is great. You build some microservices, life is good, but who's using them, right? So there's end-to-end visibility across in terms of adoption of your microservices externally and internally, and more importantly, making sure that you're getting the right kind of performance. Visibility becomes a very, very important aspect of it. So let me kind of turn it over to Chris and have him kind of walk through what does Apigee really bring into the mix. So Chris, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, sure. So I think the same way that we'd say that you need API management for a successful microservices strategy, it should come as no surprise that you also need API management for a successful API strategy. So the things that we still need to continue to think about. Microservices don't eliminate the need for all the other API concerns that we've had all along and we're going to continue to have. So obviously from an API security standpoint, being able to adhere to standards that de facto standards that have emerged, things like OAuth, put those on top of your API to secure those, as well as being able to plan for incoming waves of traffic. So can we handle distributed denial of service attacks? Can we enforce quotas if we've got if we're in an enterprise and we've got we're trying to drive innovation through APIs? That doesn't mean that all of a sudden we can stop caring about the reliability of our backend systems. We open our APIs up to everybody in the company, and all of a sudden waves of traffic come in and take out our billing system or our customer system. That's not going to bode very well for the future of our API program. So we still need to think about those type of things, along with analytics. So we want to understand how are people using APIs, how are people leveraging these. If we see uptick in traffic, and we want to track down the application responsible or the user responsible for those. These are all the things that Apigee does. These are the API-centric view, and it really doesn't matter from Apigee's perspective whether or not those APIs are built on top of a monolithic architecture, whether those are built on top of a SOAP service that's been around for a long time in a legacy application, a commercial off-the-shelf system, or whether it's built on top of something that's a much more modern microservices-based architecture. Apigee is going to provide the comprehensive API capabilities that you need, ranging from developer portals to make it easy for people to get access to APIs, through the gateway capabilities for security and traffic management, through analytics to give you visibility. The other thing we can do, and this sort of ties back to not just microservices, but also what we were describing earlier with the cloud migration, we also have what's called a micro gateway. So sometimes, we've essentially built what you might call a microlith. So I've got, a single service, but it's basically exposing its own API. Other things might be consuming this API directly, and when that happens, I might want to have a lighter weight API management solution on top of that. That's exactly what Apigee's micro gateway does, is it provides things like security, traffic management, analytics on top of your individual microservices. And Apigee is going to be, it's usually going to be complementary with a more dedicated microservices stack that you have behind the scenes. So we'll have Apigee will handle everything from an API perspective, but customers that we're working with that are really leveraging microservices almost always are doing so in conjunction with one or more tools that are purpose built for a microservices stack. So Prithpal, what are you seeing in terms of adoption in that bottom half of the picture here? Where are you seeing customers able to sort of take advantage of synergies between the microservices stack and what we're doing on the Apigee side?
Well, absolutely. I think there's quite a few examples that I can actually quote out there. One key thing is as Chris mentioned before, right, and as I mentioned before as well, that you're going to see enterprises leveraging a variety of different microservices stack, right? We have identified that an API layer kind of becomes, a very important part of your microservices strategy. So with this kind of an approach where, I see customers building stuff as Docker containers, deploying that on Kubernetes. We have big customers who are using Total Cloud Foundry. Apigee also has, integrations built to kind of make it easy to deploy stuff on Cloud Foundry. So the key takeaway, I guess, of this slide is you can use the microservices stack of your choice and be confident that, Apigee has the API management capabilities to ensure that these APIs are actually secure, managed, and you have the right kind of visibility for the enterprises. And with that, I think, let's maybe talk about a quick examples of some customers here where when I, go and talk to some of the names mentioned out here, they actually are leveraging Apigee Edge and an API management platform as an enabler to transition into microservices. Why is that the case? I think this is a very important point. As microservices become more and more popular, the need for maintaining and managing existing infrastructure doesn't disappear overnight, right? This is a very big thing which many of our key enterprise customers are facing. They still have to live up with, that. There's a ramp up to microservices. As the journey continues, be very, very cognizant and aware of what is happening to your consumers who may be using a variety of different form factor, whether that's mobile, desktop, set-top boxes, whatever the audience is. Essentially, there's some connected experiences being delivered by microservices through apps to the end user. So an API management here, such as Apigee Edge, actually becomes a big enabler for you to start surfacing those contracts where you can expose clean APIs, which are secure, which can be managed, and all those aspects can be controlled using configuration-oriented tools very, very rapidly. There's the notion of a developer portal, which kind of exposes those key microservices as consumable APIs, so you can enable apps and enable partner ecosystems. So here are sampling of some of the customers who are actually doing that today as they're embarking on the microservices journey. Now, I know, we've spoken about quite a few things, but we do want to kind of bring it back together in terms of what are some of the key takeaways for microservices. I'll just touch on a couple of those real quick, and then I'll have Chris kind of talk about some of the other ones. But I think we've identified that microservices are beneficial. It has a lot of characteristics around agility, reuse, and the ability for you to be able to kind of roll out new capabilities very quickly. It gives teams kind of this way of working independently and coming together, in terms of responding to different kinds of, requests for changing features, etc. We also saw that, APIs and microservices are super complementary, where you're using microservices-oriented kind of styles to build out new capabilities, but then also use APIs where it makes sense to kind of expose them securely, whether it is outside the enterprise boundary or making sure it has the right kind of constructs and cross-cutting concerns when you are exposing it even internally for your other apps. So Chris, any other thoughts on some of the other key takeaways for our audience out here?
Yeah, sure. I think especially the one here be aware of anti-patterns is one that resonates with me pretty heavily. So, and it comes back to that idea that be realistic about what benefits microservices are going to bring, and they do bring some very significant, very real benefits. But they're probably not going to solve world hunger for you. They're probably there probably are some overinflated expectations around how all the rainbows and unicorns that are going to come once everything has been converted to microservices. When it comes to some of the things that we touched on with the big three that you touched on there at the beginning, Paul, in terms of agility and reuse and so forth, I think those are pretty close to those are the right things to keep in mind. Once you start thinking sort of that all the problems that you have are going to be solved forever, just be aware that there are certain consequences of moving towards a highly distributed architecture like microservices, and keep that in mind. Make sure you're leveraging sort of the right technologies to help you manage that, and you can have a successful microservices platform.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. There's been a lot of activity in the Q&A pieces out here. So,
yeah,
with about maybe 12 to 13 minutes left, I think we'll kind of walk through some of the questions which have come up. So during this session, guys, feel free to answer additional questions on the bottom left side or the left-hand side of your browser. You should see a Q&A window. Here's one of the questions. Chris, I think you will love this. I'm sure we run into this so many times. Let me kind of ask the question and see if I can have you broadly address it for our audience. So one of the questions which has come up is, what is the advantage of microservices over SOA?
Yeah, I like that. I'm gonna piggyback on that with another question that's in here too, which is asking a similar question. So, don't you think microservices are essentially what the atomic services conception of SOA was meant to be? And so let me address this in a couple ways. I think when I talk about SOA, I think of two distinct things that just happen to have the same acronym. So there's service-oriented architecture, which I think started off with some very solid architectural tenets that are still just as valid today as they ever were. Things like, let's have clean interfaces, let's make things testable, let's have a service do one thing so that we can test it and we can roll it out, and it's just a way of creating quality, testable, maintainable software. I think that approach to SOA is still as valid as it ever was. SOA over time morphed. There essentially became SOA that was more driven by integration vendors and middleware vendors. There was essentially, and guys like Thomas Earl and all his books on SOA that would talk about this again, the same type of thing, this overinflated expectations of we are going to get so good at building services that we're going to do enterprise projects in the course of a couple weeks. And you would tie these into business process management things, and there may be a day soon where you're not even going to need developers anymore, those type of things. So I think the difference between the latter part of SOA, the one that was more driven by BPMs and guys like Thomas Earl and so forth, there's a much bigger difference between this type of microservice, between microservices and that type of SOA than the former. The one that's just about hey, let's write software in a good, reusable, testable way. I think microservices and APIs also, I think they still follow a lot of those same core tenets, and that's a good thing. Now, I think the biggest difference is the intent with microservices. So in my mind, the idea behind microservices is much more around the flexibility when it comes to deployments, taking advantage of modern cloud-native architectures, and all the things that come along from there. The other thing that I think is a big difference between microservices and traditional SOA is that traditional SOA is very, very theory-driven. And so it was all sort of a theoretical, if we do enough modeling of our schemas and service design and put enough governance in place, somehow all these slow processes are going to lead to a very, very fast, agile enterprise. The flip side of that is that microservices is mostly driven out of a much more pragmatic All these internet companies kind of went off, built their own architectures, and came back with things that worked for them. So you'll have Netflix that comes and says, hey, we're using this microservices approach. It's working really well for us when we have these type of problems like supporting Rokus and Apple TVs and iPhones and all these different devices. And here are the problems we have at our scale, and here's why these work. And Spotify did the same thing. So I think you can give microservices a little bit more street cred than you ever could the traditional enterprise SOA.
Yeah.
Hopefully that
so
answers
I think
that was a bit of a soapbox.
Yeah. I think that was great. But I think one key thing I wanted to highlight from what you just mentioned, Chris, is the notion of microservices must be independently deployable. I think that's a very big difference and kind of an advantage, because in many SOA implementations that we've seen, yes, you can expose them and virtualize them as services, in some cases APIs. The app components pretty much are still part of the deployment style is still monolith oriented, right? And one of the key aspects of microservices and the advantage is, because you can independently deploy and scale it quickly, the dependencies are kind of extremely minimized, right? So I think that's I just wanted to make sure we call that out. That seems to be a very, very important aspect for many enterprises who are considering microservices.
Yeah, and then we've got a related question here to Prithpal in terms of this tie-in between Apigee and microservices platforms, as well as API versus microservices, and kind of do we have examples where we've seen customers successfully leverage these? So I'd say on that front, and you may want to add some things here as well. But so one of our partners that we work very closely with is Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and so I think one of the major tier 1 carriers that we work with in the telco space is one of our top success stories when it comes to really transitioning to microservices, leveraging Apigee for the API management side and building out their API facade in front of microservices, and then leveraging our integrations with Pivotal Cloud Foundry to really accelerate that transition to microservices. So a good kind of follow-on question there, and hopefully that answers that. Anything you want to add on that?
No, I think you touched on some important points that, we actually have, big customers today who are leveraging the exact same synergies that we spoke about, where they're using stacks such as Pivotal Cloud Foundry and others to build that, and leveraging API management to kind of, enable them, expose them securely. So I think that's a reality which is happening today, and happens to be a very pragmatic approach as well. There's some other questions coming out here. How is API management software different than a traditional ESB? So let me take that one. Chris, you can add in as well. So traditionally, mostly the enterprise service buses or middleware solutions are kind of focused on the integration space, right? So the capabilities that they offer are primarily around securing certain things, virtualizing certain legacy capabilities as services. But they kind of stop there, right? That's primarily exposure related. And that's where API management actually takes on. It starts from there. API management is a lot about what kind of APIs can be very rapidly, made available so that they are consumable, right? So are these APIs that you built, are they friendly in terms of any of the app developers who want to access them, right? So it focuses a lot on API consumption. There's a notion of, I can very quickly take some of these APIs and bundle them into what we call as API products. So API products is a great mechanism to take, let's say, 10 or 20 APIs and segment them and package them differently for different needs. You could either go horizontal across different channels, such as web, certain APIs for mobile, etc., or you can say, I'm going to create some tiered offerings such as silver, gold, platinum, with increasing set of API capabilities in the increasing tiers. And all of that can be done using configuration settings, right? So that's one aspect. The third aspect is ensuring that the APIs are rapidly, consumed by app developers in a self-service way. So the whole developer portal aspect of it becomes super important, right? None of these capabilities are, commonplace of ESB or middleware solutions, which we feel are kind of layered with systems of record kind of capabilities. You have much more of your lower tier systems, and then API management essentially for all the features that we mentioned kind of becomes your systems of engagement with your customers. So you can rapidly innovate, provide the APIs, do iteration, and expose that those set of capabilities to a variety of different kinds of audiences. Okay, there's another question out here around, as microservices grow, how do you make them discoverable? What is an API catalog? Chris, do you want to just shed some light on that?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple aspects of that. So there's discoverability in terms of runtime discoverability, and there are platforms out there that specialize in handling those type of problems. And then once you want to get to the point where you're consolidating API microservices and really looking at a consumption-based, more of an API discovery that the APIs just happen to be on top of microservices, that's where an API catalog would come in. So an API catalog is going to give you more of the ability for a person, an application developer who is building something and they want to find an API that's been created, to go to your catalog, search through all the APIs that have been published, look and see what's available, have a self-service mechanism to get registered, to get access to the API, and get onboarded. So there's sort of two. There are tools that are specialized more from a system-to-system perspective. These things are popping up and bubbling down, and we want to be able to find an instance of a microservice, and so we need discovery from that standpoint. And then there's the other more human-centric discovery as well, and that would be the API catalog.
Right. Here's another good one, Chris. I'm sure I have run into this many times. I'm sure you have some thoughts on this as well. There's a question around: is there a general guideline for how much of a functionality a microservice should cover? Right? When does a microservice get too bloated and it's really a general API? And I think kind of talks into directly some of the things that we have addressed. You touched on what a monolith is and how it can be carefully refactored into some pretty, size and shape microservices. What are your experiences in your conversations with developers, right? I mean, when does it really get too bloated? When does it really become an API? I know I have a few thoughts, but why don't you go first, take a stab at it? I think it's a very important question, which many have.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that the first slides, which were sort of just in there for to kind of break the ice with humor with microservices are just these tiny little services. The more key concept in my mind is the whole idea of a bounded context. So if a service is staying within the context that it's responsible for, I think that's okay, even if that gets a little bit bigger. I don't think there's sometimes you'll see people espouse the viewpoint that microservices should be below X numbers lines of code, and I don't think that's really a good approach. I really think it's more in terms of when you look at functionality that should be deployed together or needs to be deployed together, and you look at the functionality that is being included, you look at things like, are we writing to the same database, and so forth. I think those are better guidelines to look at when something is becoming too, is basically once you're having functionality that's outside of that bounded context, then I think you've gone too big, and that's it's kind of a hard question to be very specifics on, but that's kind of my advice.
No, I think that's a great metaphor. Just one thing that if I could add to that, Chris, is, from an API exposure perspective, I think, anytime when you think about you're building microservices which are delivering capabilities which matter to the outside world or to any apps which is kind of in contract, think about those things. They're a perfect candidate for being APIs. Anytime you have microservices which are being consumed internally by other apps or your systems, and you have a reason to kind of maintain an interface, those are another good reasons for them to be, API enabled, if you would. So anyways, I think we are on the top of the time for the webinar. I know there are a few more questions. We'll try and answer them over email. But I really want to take this opportunity to kind of, thank you guys for taking your time to spend these 45 minutes with us. As always, we can continue our Q&A on the Apigee community, which is community.apigee.com. And the slides and the recording for the webinar will be available in about a couple of days. It'll be emailed to you for those who registered for the webinar. So once again, thanks from me and Chris for you guys to, looks like we have some more time here for a few. Okay, Chris, do you want to take maybe a couple more sessions here, a couple more questions?
Yeah, sure. There are a couple that I want to be respectful of people's time, but there are a couple things on here that I just wanted to mention. So one of the questions was on like I mentioned, some aspects of distributed computing and being aware of. So of course, I mean the core computer science theorem on that is going to be CAP theorem. There's also a great book that talks about the trade-offs of Distributed Systems, Principles and Paradigms by Andrew Tenenbaum is kind of the classic text on this topic. So I would say take a look at those. Those are interesting reads just for to kind of understand the more general computer science aspects of what I was describing earlier.
Okay. Hey, there's another one out here. I think we should tackle this one. Is the transition from SOA to microservices a mandatory transformation before making use of the Apigee platform, right? So that's a very good question. So the answer is no, you do not need to kind of transform into microservices. In fact, some of the customers that we had flashed on one of the slides out there, the reality is many of them have investments in ESBs and middleware solutions. If anything, they leverage the API management here as a way to kind of enable that microservices journey. So as we were talking about clean, consumable APIs, which could rapidly be configured on Apigee Edge at the API management platform tier. And as you do that, you're able to then move some capabilities to the microservices kind of architecture and then leverage the same API management tooling to now connect the customers who are connected to this specific APIs to microservices. So if anything, it actually enables it. So it's not definitely a requirement to, you make use of the Apigee platform. We have many customers, especially one of the tier one telcos that we just mentioned, who are exactly doing the same thing, right? They're leveraging Apigee Edge as the API management platform to expose clean APIs. And then, as they're transforming to the microservices journey, it becomes a big enabler. All right. So once again, thanks everybody. Thanks everybody for attending the webinar. As I mentioned, please carry on our conversations at community.apigee.com. And then for those who have attended the webinar, the slides and the recordings will be emailed to you. Thank you.